The late June sun hung low over the rolling hills of Franklin, Tennessee, casting a golden haze across the sprawling grounds of Willow Creek Venue. The air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, mingling with the faint tang of barbecue from the caterers setting up near the barn. Rows of white chairs lined an open field, their backs draped in ivory lace, facing a wooden arch woven with wildflowers. It was the kind of wedding that felt like a painting, every detail deliberate, every moment heavy with meaning. Marcus Caldwell pulled his old Ford pickup into the gravel lot, the engine coughing once before settling into silence. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, his calloused fingers tracing the worn leather. At 52, Marcus carried the weight of his years in the lines etched around his eyes, but his posture, straight, unyielding, betrayed the Marine he'd been for 2 decades. His dress blues, pressed to perfection, hugged his broad shoulders, the medals pinned to his chest glinting faintly in the fading light. He hadn't worn the uniform in years, not since his last deployment, but today was different. Today was for Lena. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, and smoothed the front of his jacket. In his breast pocket, tucked beside a folded handkerchief, was a photo, yellowed at the edges, creased from years of handling. It showed Lena at 3, her pigtails bouncing as she sat on his shoulders, her mother, Sarah, laughing beside them. Sarah had been gone 7 years now, taken by cancer that moved faster than any of them could brace for. Marcus felt her absence like a shadow, but today he carried her with him, just as he carried Lena. The walk to the venue was slow, deliberate. Parents milled about, some clutching programs, others snapping photos of the floral arch kids darted between chairs, giggling, while a string quartet tuned up near the ceremony site. Marcus scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp, instinctive. He spotted Lena's fiancé, Ethan, adjusting his tie near the barn, looking nervous but happy. Good kid, Marcus thought. He'd given Ethan the shovel talk 2 years ago, but the boy had earned his respect since then. At the entrance, a young woman in a navy blazer checked names off a tablet. Marcus handed her his invitation, the cream cardstock embossed with Lena's and Ethan's names. She glanced at it, then at him, her smile faltering for a split second before she nodded. "Welcome, Mr. Caldwell. Ceremony's that way." She pointed toward the field, her voice clipped. Marcus nodded, unfazed. He'd felt those looks before, quick, subtle, gone before you could call them out. He was a black man in a Marine uniform, tall and broad, walking into a mostly white venue in a small southern town. He knew what some glances meant, and he knew how to let them slide. He made his way to the family section, 3rd row from the front, and took a seat. The chair creaked under his weight, but he settled in, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the arch where Lena would soon stand. Around him, the crowd buzzed. A woman in a floral dress fanned herself with a program. A man in a suit grumbled about the heat. Marcus didn't move, didn't fidget. His world had narrowed to the moment ahead, the moment he promised Sarah he'd be here for. He thought of Lena, her stubborn streak, her laugh that echoed her mother's. She'd planned this wedding down to the napkin folds, and Marcus had stayed out of her way, offering only a check for the flowers and a quiet promise to walk her down the aisle. The quartet struck up a soft melody, and the crowd began to settle. Marcus glanced at his watch, 10 minutes to go. He allowed himself a small smile, the kind that didn't show teeth but carried everything he felt. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw them, 2 security guards moving down the aisle, their steps purposeful, their eyes locked on him. The guards weren't subtle. Their black polos, emblazoned with elite security in yellow stitching, stretched tight across their chests. The shorter one, with a buzz cut and a jaw that looked like it was always clenched, led the way. The taller one trailed behind, his face softer but his posture stiff, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be there. Both had radios clipped to their belts, earpieces dangling loose. They stopped beside Marcus's chair, casting shadows across his lap. "Sir," the shorter guard said, his voice low but firm, "we need to speak with you outside." Marcus didn't flinch. His hand stayed on his knees, his eyes still on the arch. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone steady, measured. The taller guard shifted his weight. This section's reserved for immediate family. We got a complaint about seating. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting the shorter guard's gaze. This is my daughter's wedding. I'm her father. My seat's right here. The guard, his badge red Tanner, didn't blink. We were told this row's full. There's space in the back. Let's not make this a thing. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out the invitation he'd shown at the entrance. He held it up, not breaking eye contact. Third row, family section. My name's on the list. You want to check it again? Tanner didn't take the invitation. His jaw tightened, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping. Look, sir, we're just doing our job. Let's keep this civil. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that came from years of facing down worse than this. I'm sitting right here to watch my daughter get married. You want to tell me who gave that order? The taller guard, badge reading Ellis, glanced around, noticing a few heads turning. A woman 2 rows back whispered to her husband, her eyes wide. A man in the 5th row tilted his phone, the lens catching the scene. Ellis cleared his throat. It's not personal, just policy. Extra seats are in the back. Marcus didn't move. Not personal, he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. You're asking me to leave my daughter's wedding, and you're telling me it's not personal. Tanner's hand hovered near his radio, his fingers twitching. Sir, I'm asking you one more time. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The air shifted the way it does when a line gets crossed. Marcus felt it, the weight of eyes, the hush of nearby conversations. He'd been here before, in different places, different uniforms. The quiet assumptions, the subtle pushes, the phrases that sounded polite but weren't. He took a slow breath, grounding himself. He didn't want a scene, not today. He wanted to see Lena in her dress, to walk her down the aisle, to keep his promise to Sarah. I'm not moving, Marcus said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. You do what you need to do. Tanner's face reddened. He muttered something into his radio, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Ellis stepped back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The quartet played on, oblivious, but the crowd wasn't. A woman in a yellow hat leaned forward, her lips pursed. A teenager nudged his mom, pointing. Marcus kept his gaze forward, his jaw set, his hands still. Then the barn door creaked open, and 5 men stepped into the field. They didn't rush, didn't draw attention, but their presence was like a ripple in still water. No uniforms, just tailored jackets and steady strides. Marcus didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who they were. The 5 men didn't move as a unit, but they carried the same weight, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, steps measured. They spread out, taking positions around the seating area. One settled near the aisle, arms crossed. Another leaned against a post by the barn, his gaze scanning the crowd. The third found a spot in the back row, his hands in his pockets, but his posture alert. The 4th and 5th stood near the quartet, their faces calm but unyielding. Marcus kept his focus on the arch, but his mind flicked back 16 years to a dusty valley in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He'd been a gunnery sergeant then, leading a squad through a night that turned into hell. An ambush had pinned them down, RPGs screaming, gunfire spitting from the ridges. Marcus had pulled 3 men from a burning Humvee, then gone back for 2 more, dragging them through sand that felt like fire. Those men, Davis, Ruiz, Harper, Coleman, and Wells, were the ones who made it out. They'd bled together, breathed together, survived together. And they made a pact. If one called, the others came. No questions, no hesitation. Back in the present, Tanner hadn't noticed the newcomers yet. He was too focused on Marcus, his hand now resting on his belt, not on a weapon, but close enough to make a point. You're making this a problem, he said, his voice louder now, drawing more eyes. We don't want trouble, but you're not giving us a choice. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. You're the one making choices, he said, and you're about to make a bad one. Ellis tugged at Tanner's sleeve, his voice low. Man, let's just go. This isn't worth it. Tanner shook him off. No, he doesn't get to sit here and act like he owns the place. That's when the first voice cut through, clear and steady, from 10 feet away. Is there a reason you're harassing this man? It came from a man by the aisle, Davis, the oldest of the five, his hair graying, but his frame still solid. His jacket was navy, his tie loose, but his eyes were like knives. Tanner spun around, caught off guard. "Who are you?" Davis took a step forward, his voice dropping just enough to make the air feel heavy. "I asked you a question." Tanner blinked, his confidence wavering. Ellis looked from Davis to Marcus, then back to Tanner, his face pale. The crowd was fully watching now, the quartet's music fading into background noise. A woman gasped softly. A man stood, craning his neck to see. Another man, Ruiz, lean and wiry, stood up from the back row. "You're embarrassing yourselves," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Walk away." Tanner's hand twitched toward his radio again, but before he could speak, a third voice joined in. Harper, standing by the barn. "You don't touch that man. You don't tell him to move. You don't ask again." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, charged with the kind of respect that didn't need words. Marcus stayed seated, his expression unchanged, but inside, something shifted. Not relief, not pride, but recognition. These men weren't here for show. They were here because of a bond forged in blood and dust, a bond that didn't fade with time. Tanner looked around, realizing he wasn't just facing Marcus anymore. He was facing something bigger, something he didn't understand. Ellis grabbed his arm, harder this time. "Tanner, let's go. Now." But Tanner wasn't ready to back down. His ego was in too deep. He leaned closer to Marcus, his voice a hiss. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable? This is a private event, not your parade ground." Marcus didn't blink. "And you think that badge gives you power? You're standing in my daughter's wedding, telling me to leave. You're the one out of line." That's when Davis stepped into the aisle, his presence like a wall. "You're done," he said, his voice low, final. "Walk away, or you'll wish you had." The other four Marines closed in, not aggressively, but with a quiet intensity that filled the space. Coleman, the tallest, stood by the quartet, his arms folded. Wells, the youngest, leaned forward in the back row, his eyes locked on Tanner. The crowd was silent now, every eye on the scene. Even the quartet faltered, their notes trailing off. A woman in a suit, likely the venue coordinator, hurried over, her face flushed. She whispered something to Tanner, her hands gesturing frantically. Whatever she said was enough. Tanner stepped back, his face burning, and muttered something to Ellis. The two turned and walked toward the barn, their steps quick, their heads down. The crowd exhaled, a collective release of tension. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on the arch, waiting for Lena. The quartet picked up again, a soft rendition of Canon in D, and the crowd settled back into their seats, though the energy had changed. Whispers rippled through the rows, heads turning to glance at Marcus, then at the five men who'd returned to their spots. Davis sat near the aisle, his posture relaxed but alert. Ruiz leaned back in the back row, his eyes scanning the crowd. Harper, Coleman, and Wells blended into the scene, but their presence lingered like a low hum. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, not as a victory, but as a reminder. He'd faced worse than Tanner and Ellis. Desk-side briefings where his reports were questioned, promotions passed over, glances that lingered too long in places they shouldn't. But today wasn't about fighting those battles. It was about Lena, about the promise he'd made to Sarah to be here, fully present, for their daughter. The barn doors opened again, and the bridal party stepped out. Bridesmaids in blush pink floated down the aisle, their smiles bright but nervous. Ethan took his place under the arch, his hands clasped, his grin wide enough to light the field. Then the music shifted, and every head turned. Lena appeared, her white dress catching the last of the sunlight. Her veil trailed behind her, delicate as a whisper, and her arm rested lightly on the arm of her uncle, Marcus's brother, who'd stepped in for the rehearsal. But today, Marcus would walk her the rest of the way. He stood, slow and steady, and moved to the aisle. The crowd rose, a soft murmur of awe rippling through. Lena's eyes found Marcus, and her smile broke wide, the kind that made her look like Sarah. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not with pain, but with something deeper, pride, love, the weight of years. He offered his arm, and she took it, her hand trembling slightly. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "You clean up pretty good yourself, Dad," she teased, her voice soft. They walked together, every step measured, every glance shared. The crowd faded, the whispers gone. It was just Marcus and Lena, father and daughter, moving toward a moment they'd both carried for years. At the arch, Marcus lifted her veil, kissed her forehead, and handed her to Ethan. He stepped back, taking his seat, his eyes never leaving her. The ceremony began, vows exchanged, laughter breaking through tears. Lena's voice cracked as she promised to love Ethan through every storm. Ethan's hands shook as he slid the ring onto her finger. Marcus watched, his face calm, but his heart full. He thought of Sarah, how she'd have cried and laughed and fixed Lena's veil a dozen times. He reached into his pocket, touching the photo, and felt her there with him. But Lena had seen more than she let on. From the moment she'd stepped into the field, she'd noticed the tension, the way her father sat, the way the guards had hovered, the way 5 men she didn't know had stood like sentinels. She hadn't heard the words, but she'd felt the shift, the same way she'd felt it as a kid when her dad came home from deployments, his silence heavier than his stories. She glanced at Marcus now, her eyes searching, but he gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "Focus on your moment." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted, clapping, whistling, cheering. Lena and Ethan kissed, and the field came alive with joy. But what stood out was the rhythm of the applause, deliberate, unified. Davis, Ruiz, Harper, Coleman, and Wells clapped in sync, their hands rising and falling like a drumbeat. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, a salute to Lena, to Marcus, to the day. Lena turned, her eyes finding the 5 men. She didn't know their names, but she knew their weight. She looked at Marcus, and he gave her another nod, this one softer, prouder. The crowd kept clapping, some standing, some wiping tears, not fully understanding why, but knowing they'd witnessed something that mattered. The reception spilled into the barn, string lights casting a warm glow over long tables draped in white. The band struck up a lively tune, and guests filled the dance floor, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. Marcus sat at a table near the edge, a glass of water in hand, watching Lena twirl with Ethan, her dress fanning out like a bloom. He didn't dance, not his thing, but he soaked in every moment, every smile. Davis approached, pulling out a chair. "You good, Gunny?" he asked, using Marcus's old rank. Marcus nodded. "Better than good. Thanks for showing up." Davis shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "You call, we come. Always." Ruiz joined them, a beer in hand. "Those guards didn't know what hit him," he said, chuckling. "Should have seen their faces when we stood up." Harper, Coleman, and Wells drifted over, their voices low but warm. They didn't talk about the confrontation, not directly. They talked about old times, nights in the desert, bad MREs, the way Marcus always carried extra socks for the squad. But the subtext was clear. They'd been there today, just as they'd been there in Hellman, because Marcus was their brother. Lena found them later, her veil gone, her cheeks flushed from dancing. She hugged Marcus first, then turned to the 5 men, her eyes bright. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but thank you for whatever that was out there." Davis stood, offering his hand. "Davis, your dad saved my life. We're just returning the favor." One by one, they introduced themselves, Ruiz, Harper, Coleman, Wells. Lena shook their hands, her smile wavering as she processed it. "He never told me," she said, glancing at Marcus. Marcus shrugged. "Didn't need to. They're family." Lena's eyes glistened, but she held it together. "Well, you're all invited to the next one," she joked, gesturing to the dance floor. "No security allowed." The men laughed, and Marcus felt something loosen inside him. Not grief, not pain, but the weight of carrying it all alone. He looked at Lena, at the men around him, and knew Sarah was there, in the laughter, in the light. Later, as the night wound down, Marcus and Lena stepped outside, the air cool against their skin. The stars were out, bright against the Tennessee sky. Lena leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I saw what happened," she said quietly. Before the ceremony, I wanted to say something, but you handled it. Marcus nodded. You didn't need to. You had your moment. She looked up at him. Why didn't you fight back? You could have shut them down. Marcus took a breath, choosing his words. Because fighting's easy. Standing your ground, staying calm, letting the truth speak. That's harder. That's what people remember. Lena was quiet for a moment, then smiled. You're kind of badass, Dad. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Just a dad who loves his girl. They walked back to the truck, the photos still in his pocket, the night still alive around them. Marcus thought of Hellman, of Sarah, of the men who'd stood with him today. He thought of Lena, starting her new life, carrying the strength he'd tried to pass on. As they drove away, the barn fading in the rear view, Marcus spoke one last time. Life will test you, Lena. It'll push you, try to move you. But you don't have to shout to be heard. You just stand, and the right people will stand with you. Lena nodded, her hand resting on his arm. I learned that from you. The road stretched ahead, dark but certain, and Marcus drove on, knowing some moments don't fade, some bonds don't break, and some silences speak louder than words. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to know what strength really means. Because in a world full of noise, it's the quiet ones who change everything.